Today we celebrate the fourth Sunday of Advent. We're almost at Christmas time. And today our readings get us ready for the idea that Jesus truly will be born in our midst, in Bethlehem, but hopefully also in our hearts. The first reading talks about King David. King David asked Nathan, his spiritual counselor, whether it's okay if he builds a house for the Lord. Now, a house for the Lord means a temple. He says, I'm living in a house of cedar. That would be considered to be the best house possible. How is it that the Lord, the Ark of the Covenant, is dwelling in a tent? And this sounds very good, but there's a little bit of arrogance behind it. David thinks he's going to do God a favor by building him a temple. So Nathan comes back and says, no, David, you're not going to build a house for God. God's going to give you a house. And when he says that, he's not talking about a palace. He's talking about a dynasty. Up to this time, the judges of Israel were called as charismatic leaders. You didn't have an occasion in which a judge was followed by his son. God would call whoever was most fit. And then even the first king of Israel, Saul, was anointed by Samuel, almost out of the blue. And then remember David. David was not Saul's son. David was from another family from Bethlehem. He wasn't even the oldest, the strongest, the most handsome. And yet God judged the hearts and called David. Well, now David's son will follow him on the throne. And this will be true all the time until the time of the exile, that the king in Jerusalem will be a son of David. There will be a dynasty, and we'll see that fulfilled in the gospel. The second reading is from the letter to the Romans, and it speaks about the mystery of God's salvation, that God had a plan for our salvation, but it only came about in these times through the person of Jesus. A dynasty, a mystery. We see both of these ideas fulfilled in the gospel from the Gospel of Luke, the Annunciation story. The archangel Gabriel comes up to Mary, who's a virgin, betrothed to Joseph, who's a carpenter. Now, in those days, betrothed meant a lot more than engaged. It meant that they really were almost married. They just weren't living together yet. And the fact that Joseph was a carpenter also tells us something about the Holy Family. They were poor as church mice, because the people who were considered a little better off were the farmers. They had land on which they could farm. If you were an artisan like a carpenter, it meant your family had lost their land. You had to scratch out a living. So these are very poor people. The archangel Gabriel says to Mary, "Hail, full of grace." Now, in our ear, when we hear it in English, it sounds like a nice greeting. But in Greek, the language in which the gospel was written, it's much more significant. Luke uses a tense of the verb, a time, which talks about something that began in the past, but is still true now. The flowers bloomed yesterday. They're still blooming today. I'm from Buffalo. It snowed. You can say that almost any month. There's still snow on the ground today. Mary is full of grace, not because the angel showed up. She's always been full of grace, what we call the Immaculate Conception. The angel is proclaiming this to Mary, and she's a little bit frightened because the angel seems to be able to see right into her heart. The angel tells her, you're going to have a child, a son of the Most High. Now, son of the Most High, when we Christians hear that, we think son of God. But we have to realize that in those days, the time of Mary, Jesus, it didn't quite mean that. It meant a hero. He would also be a son of David. Remember how we heard of a dynasty in that first reading? Now the dynasty is being enthroned again. Jesus will be a son of David. Now that's a title we're not going to hear again until Palm Sunday, when Jesus enters Jerusalem and they all proclaim him the king, the son of David. Mary says, how can this be? I'm a virgin. Remember, she's not yet living with Joseph, and she's obviously understanding that Joseph is not going to be the father. How can this be? Now, it's interesting. A little before this, Zechariah had met the same archangel in the temple. And the archangel said, God has listened to your prayers, and you're going to have a kid. Zechariah says, how can this be? And Gabriel says, bad question, Zechariah. You're going to be mute for the next 9 months. Gabriel meets Mary. She says, how can this be? And Gabriel says, good question, Mary. Let me tell you. Why the different treatment? Well, in the case of Zechariah and Elizabeth had been praying for years to have a child. But when Gabriel said, your prayers have been answered, it's obvious Zechariah never believed in the power of his own prayer. Whereas Mary had not yet been praying for a child. She's not married. And to have this child will put her in danger. She has a legitimate question. And what is she told? The Holy Spirit will overshadow you. This reminds us of how on the Ark of the Covenant there were 2 cherubim. And where their wings met in the middle is where God would appear to his people as a cloud. Mary is being presented as the new Ark of the Covenant, because inside of her, she will hold that which is most precious to all of us, Christ the Lord. The archangel also tells Mary, your cousin Elizabeth, whom everybody thought was barren, is now 6 months pregnant, because anything is possible with God. What is Mary's response? Let it be done unto me according to your word. Mary surrenders to the will of God. She doesn't want to shape her own destiny. She wants to surrender and do that which God calls her to do. Isn't that a great example for our spiritual life? Surrender. To not be in charge. St. Teresa of Avila was once asked, how do you make God laugh? And the answer is, tell him your plans. When we think we're in charge, we get ourselves in trouble. When we surrender as Mary did, when we place ourselves totally in the hands of God, then Christ becomes present again in our words, in our actions, in our hearts.